Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse. Alongside, as always, Mr. Martin Popoff. Good
Yes,
morning.
morning, sir. Morning, sir. A little nervous about this one. This is gonna be a little weird, but it's a nice sunny day, and hopefully that'll inspire us to
I think
get moving
so.
here. So,
Not a cloud in the sky, Martin. I think it's a crisp, 60 degrees out. It's supposed to be a nice weekend. Got the
excellent.
pool open.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
little too cold to swim, obviously, but it's open.
yeah.
Looking crystal clear. I got the grass is mowed. Everything's looking good for spring. So, yeah. So Martin and I have been percolating this idea for a couple of weeks now, and we kind of got started from a conversation about what's perfect music, right? Is music perfect? Are there any specific genres that are perfect? And we figured, well, we could probably make a case for a bunch of different genres on why it might be perfect, maybe why it's not perfect, right? So we've titled this is heavy metal perfect music because I think we have a lot of people who watch this show and the channel in general who are metal fans, right? So we're going to talk about why we think metal might or might not be perfect. We're going to talk about jazz. We're going to talk about prog. We're going to talk about blues. We're going to talk about pop and punk and hip hop and all sorts of stuff. And we'll come up with some arguments about why we think it might be perfect. Maybe music in general isn't perfect at all. I don't know. We'll find out. So anyway, Martin, you want to kind of take it from there?
Yeah, it's an idea that I've always sort of had this this debate about, and I've even when I've done my cool thing was when I got to go to Finland on an all expenses paid trip for a week to speak at a heavy metal conference on my Who Invented Heavy Metal book. It came up, right? This idea of why do you like heavy metal? It's almost like is it perfect music? How much of it is perfect? What's perfect about it? What's not? But essentially the question is, why do you like heavy metal? What is there to like about heavy metal, sort of thing? And then that flips over to this definition of the word perfect. And yeah, so we're going to compare it to we're going to compare a bunch of genres and say, why is it sensible to like this? Why is it not sensible to like this? And mix it in with the idea of a children's taste in foods, adults taste in foods, kind of thing. And so that's kind of going to come up here as well. So I'm going to start with the heavy metal one. And as we've discussed, we've each got three genres that we're going to try focus on, sort of thing. So I thought I'd pick this one first, and I've got a few props here. So it's funny. I go to my CD wall, the 18,000 CDs, and go, I have to find a heavy metal album. You know how long that took me? That took me a long time. I'm going, what do I pick off this wall to represent heavy metal, right? So it's funny, but so I'm just wandering around staring blankly. But I've got an old Cradle of Filth album here. So they say this is a heavy metal album. I've got a Mastodon album. Apparently, this is a heavy metal band.
Yes,
Um,
indeed.
and then this Dimmu Borgir band apparently are a heavy metal band, right?
Yes, indeed.
So the idea is to like heavy metal. It's like, okay, so what is perfect about heavy metal? Why would we think it's perfect? Why do we like heavy metal? So I've often said, this idea of theoretical music, right? So the idea of black metal, for example. Well, okay, so the idea of liking heavy metal. Sometimes I've said the definition of heavy metal is a bunch of people crowding around like an oil drum, with fire in it, warming your hands off of a riff, right? So it's about riffs, right? But also a little bit analogous to that is the beauty of heavy metal is a bunch of guys crowding around the hood of a hot car up, and there's a guy sitting in there revving the engine. They're all oohing and on. The engine's all shampooed and everything, and there's all kind of colored doodads all over the place, and the wires are red and blue and stuff like that, right? So, and then the idea of a hot car being also kind of like an illegal thing anyways. You're not, if you speed in your hot car, you will get your license taken away, and then your hot car sits in your garage, right? So the interesting thing about loving heavy metal is this thing that I think the thing that makes it perfect, or makes it a desirable thing, is this idea of building a beautiful, beautiful machine. So it's like a fine Swiss watch sort of thing. So it's a little bit theoretical, but there's certain things about it that aren't perfect. So the idea that, as we compare these genres, I'm going to try focus, on each genre as we go, kind of thing. But the thing about it that's not perfect is you think God invented the guitar, and it wasn't even amplified, right? And then it was amplified, and then you put distortion on it, right? Like distortion is causing an imperfection. It's making it less perfect. It's like noise. Distortion equals noise. It's like,
years, yes.
why do we like distortion, right? So now we're getting down to the idea of adult taste versus kids taste, right? Kids cereal, sugar, cotton candy, right? And then when you grow up, you like oysters and whiskey and beer and coffee, right? It's like, and a kid's just going to spit that stuff out, right? So it's like there are the perfect things about heavy metal, I think, are that it sounds impressive. And this, I wanted to get to something, I've said this before many times too, but the idea that Heart's own favorite songs and Dire Straits maybe own favorite songs, and fans' favorite songs by those two bands are Money for Nothing and Barracuda, in a way, right? And so it's like the Dire Straits one, and then you think of Jefferson Starship and people think Jane, and Kansas is maybe Carry On Wayward Son, and that gets into a genre you're going to talk about as well. But so the funny thing here is that, you watch all those goofy fake celebrities at the Grammys or something, and then when the heavy band comes on, everybody's eyes light up and they get all excited, right? And then you even hear bands themselves. I've interviewed bands that aren't heavy bands that they say, oh, what really wakes us up is when we get to play that super heavy song of ours, right? And so there's just certain things where you go, okay, I understand heavy metal is an adult taste thing versus a kid's taste thing, but there are certain things about it where you go, there is kind of a perfect thing here. It is impressive, just for some whatever weird reason or definition you want to put on the word impressive. It's impressive even if you're not a metal fan. This idea of, everybody gets excited, even if you don't like metal at all, everybody kind of gets excited about Lemmy and Ace of Spades, right? Even if you're a normie or a mainstream sort of person. So there's certain things about metal that are like that. And then it gets extreme when we talk about extreme stuff like this, or even more primitive than Dimmu. But you think of it's not sensible to like a black metal vocal. It's not sensible to like a death metal vocal. It's not even sensible to like a James Hetfield vocal, or a Phil Anselmo, right? You have to have sophisticated tastes in music to want to hear somebody do that versus a crystal clear, perfect singing voice, right? These guys record badly on purpose. Remember the idea of, the first bands that ever did that were Motorhead and Venom, kind of, right? And then it became an aesthetic, right? So as soon as you start using this word aesthetic, you're into the sophisticated world of adult tastes versus kids' tastes, right? So black metal's got that. I even talk about the idea of, in the 50s, teenagers were inflamed by a rock and roll beat, right? And then a rock and roll beat got heavier and it got cooler and it got, more rock and rollsy and heavy and stuff. And then you get into black metal. So then you get the birth of a thrash metal beat, and you go, well, that's kind of it takes a sophisticated person to like that, because it's not even very groovy. It's not even very rock and roll. And then you get to black metal and it's like tick, 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 tick on your desk, a blast beat. And a blast beat is less heavy than a thrash beat, which is kind of less heavy than an old Black Sabbath beat in a way, right? So all of a sudden it's like they've taken heavy metal, pushed it over a cliff, and said, no, this is as heavy as it gets, right?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, and they're yelling at you about hatred, right? And burning down churches and killing people and death to God and Jesus and all this stuff, right? So it's like they've ticked off every box of everything that's not sensible to like about music, and there's nothing left in terms of like, there's nothing perfect left about it, right? And yet it's a beautiful aesthetic and millions of people love it. And but again, it's pushed so far to the end of the beyond perfection. It's it's just made so, yeah, primitive and bad sounding in a way, right? And it even goes to the lingo. It's like, oh, bad, oh, that's, bad means good, right? And all that sort of thing. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for heavy metal, because yeah, we've got five more genres to go through, right? And we'll have more comparisons. But just to sum up, is heavy metal perfect music? I would say it's about 40% perfect. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, music is supposed to inspire you, and it's supposed to drive you to a reaction, right? I think there's a lot of people who want music to be soothing and relaxing, and then there's a certain amount of other people like us who want the music to inspire us, to fire us up, right? To get us excited, right? And I think that's why metal for a lot of people is perfect music, because it inspires you to a frame of mind that is a little bit different than your normal frame of mind, right? So people love the aggression. They will, look at like a mosh pit, for example, right?
Yeah.
Why, under normal circumstances, why would you want to be circling around a pit, smashing into people, getting elbowed in the face and fall on the floor and thrown in the air? I mean, does that sound fun to anybody? To most people, no. But to metal fans who are into that sort of thing, that is a release, right? The music helps drive this atmosphere. It's like to a lot of people, a mosh pit is fun, right? Yeah, you may get hurt a little bit, but it's fun. We all have a good time. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you talk to so many people who are not metal fans, and they can't understand why anybody would listen to, like, black and death metal, for an example. Most people are like, why would you want to listen to that? You can't understand a word they're singing. It's they're either screaming or they're growling, and the music is just harsh and just unrelenting. And the blast beats, I don't get it, right? It's not music. Some people don't think it's musical, but yet to a lot of people, like you said, millions of people, it's the sweetest music ever, right? Even though I think most metal fans know that there are consistencies about the music that do not appeal to the masses, to a lot of people. So yeah, we could talk for this entire hour about metal in general, I think, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to talk first about jazz. Jazz was kind of a no-brainer for this episode, because I think for jazz purists, there is no more perfect style of music ever played in this entire universe, in the history of the world. But you can hear jazz, elements of jazz, in lots of different other musical forms. I mean, jazz kind of pops up all over the place, not just unto itself. It's mostly instrumental, which, when you go back to the history of music, most origins of music are instrumental. It's just instruments played together. It's pure music. And though a lot of jazz contains memorable melodies, well thought out and crafted and written melodies, and could be considered accessible by some people, because improvisation plays such a huge part in jazz arrangements, which leaves room for plenty of soloing, okay, it really makes it more of musicians' music, right, than general listening. It can often be looked at as spontaneous and unpredictable, which for many people adds to the enjoyment factor of it, right? There's no standard song structure, verse, chorus, none of that, right? Jazz, unpredictable, anything can happen, right? Which for many people, myself included, I could listen to, Kind of Blue by Miles Davis over and over and over again, but there's an unpredictable nature of the music where almost every time I listen to it, I hear a little something different. And this is old music. I mean, jazz has been around for many, many years. And, back in like the 30s and 40s and 50s, it was kind of considered, you had the big band jazz bands. You had some was not instrumental. Sometimes you had high profile guys like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole who would sing to jazz arrangements. You had, Carnegie Hall and very high prestige places would have lots of jazz big bands. You'd have dancing and whatnot. You got Benny Goodman was really big at the time. Instruments, pure non-electric instruments, traditionally speaking, right? I think you talked before about adding distortion and electronics and all that sort of thing, which kind of takes music away from its purest form. Piano, saxophone, trumpet, trombone, bass and drums, right? Maybe acoustic guitar, that sort of thing. Very horn and woodwind oriented. Some people find jazz perfect because it's easier to listen to. You don't have to worry about vocals. The whole vocal thing, right, comes in. Not all vocalists are perfect. The whole timbre of the voice. Are they on pitch? Are they off pitch? With jazz, for the most part, yes, there are jazz vocalists, but for the most part, it's instrumental. You don't have to worry about that, right? And again, the whole mostly acoustic nature of it. Back in the 60s, though, all of a sudden, a lot of musicians wanted to electrify jazz with the rock music coming into prominence, right? Psychedelia coming into prominence. All of a sudden, you're moving from mostly acoustic things like, Herbie Hancock's original piano-led stuff, Thelonious Monk, right? Charlie Mingus, all wonderful acoustic-based albums. And then all of a sudden you got bands like Weather Report, right, who were adding electronic stuff into their music. Chick Corea, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin, Miles Davis even, right? To the point where now all of a sudden you've got this thing called fusion, right, which is or jazz fusion or jazz rock, which is kind of taking rock music and psychedelic music and fusing it with traditional jazz, and all of a sudden you've got this electrified thing. Well, to the jazz purists at the time, that was horrible, because jazz is perfect as it is. Acoustic jazz that's the purest form. That's the perfect form. That's the way we like it. We don't need rock, which to jazz snobs, right, rock is not perfect music, right? So it's interesting how you have this dichotomy between people who are really, really into jazz, which is arguably a pretty small subset of music listeners, who feel that this music is absolutely perfect because it is just music, right? There's not all these other things. And, we'll talk about it later, modern recording and the recording techniques. You get the musicians in a studio, you record them in a couple-hour session, and then you're done with it. Bare bones production values, very, very kind of plain and simple, of the essence, capture the musicians. That's what you got, right? And then, later on, you've got these, fusion albums that incorporate elements of jazz, but also little bits of prog, and it's very, very complicated and very almost mechanical, because it's you've got all these electronic instruments, and everything is written to be very, very like mind-blowing to the listener, right? Do you want to be impressed? We want to show you our musicality and our virtuosity, that sort of thing. So jazz goes off into a lot of different directions, because it can be very noisy and noodly, right? To some people, I know plenty of people who can't listen to jazz at all, because it's like, it's just so atonal. There's too much soloing. There's not enough melody. There's no vocals, all that sort of thing. But to other people, jazz is absolutely perfect, because it's just instruments. It's just creating music at its purest form. So, whether you're a John Coltrane or a Charlie Parker or a Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, Chick Corea, Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, whatever it might be. There's lots and lots of classic jazz artists from throughout the history of the genre, who have created what is considered classic music and maybe perfect music, but to some people, not so much.
Yeah, that's great. And you're convincing me, like, we're calling this is heavy metal perfect music. And I'm already sort of thinking, I think jazz is more perfect music than heavy metal, because, starting with that whole vocal thing, it's like, okay, so you want a beer, right? So a jazz person would say, here's your beer. But if you add vocals to it, I now want to see you drink that beer and eat an ice cream cone at the same time, sort of thing.
Right.
It's like, who is this person singing? What are they? They're distracting us from the perfection of the music by saying things, right? And singing and speaking, and it's like, it's not even an instrument, it's a voice, and all this. And jazz people would also say, like, what is more perfect than thinking on the fly and doing improv, right? What is more perfect in a musical sense of people bouncing off of each other and playing off of each other in a room, reacting rather than recording tracks separately. And again, that whole idea of the acoustic instruments. I mean, most jazz instruments, really, even a jazz drum set, the way it's recorded, it's literally like you can almost picture it's like mainlining music right into your veins,
Very
right?
sparse. Yeah.
With no distractions, right? With no pedal board. Um, or banks of Keith Emerson synthesizers or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
so it's electronics. What is electronics? Nobody knows what that is, right? It's like, but everybody knows like what a saxophone is. It's real obvious what's going on, and so it's this idea of pure tone. And I know I've mentioned this before, but that this little argument I had with Steve Vai once, right? About I was kind of needling him, trying to get him to think along the lines of, boy, when you play high up the fretboard, it's really annoying, right? But I kind of couched in the idea of it's pure sound, right? And he was like, well, piano is pure sound, right? And all this, right? So pure sound is Steve Vai way up the fretboard, but a massive Metallica riff is not pure sound. It's got distractions, distortions added to it, right? And whatever chorus, wah wah, Kirk Hammett or whatever. So yeah, I totally agree. And then the funny thing is, again, you mentioned the ambition of it, right? So it's purer music than heavy metal, to look at the two so far, in that it actually took more work to be that good a musician. It's more chopsy, right?
Yeah.
So you're working your way towards a sensible, objective, definition of perfection by saying this guy is literally like the fastest runner in the 100-yard dash, right? He's really, really good at what he does. So he's closer to perfect, versus a heavy metal guy, who maybe is limited in what he can play or whatever. You don't think of the jazz guy like that because it is jazz. So it's like you always see in interviews, these guys are always really snobby about who was let into the club or not, right? I mean, it's a really like sort of tense, pressury relationship, like, pass a jazz audition, right?
Oh yeah, and you have to be of a certain level from
Yeah.
your skill level to be, because if you ever go to see a really good jazz band playing, I'm not just talking about from the classic days, even today, you watch how all those musicians are in sync with each other. They're all watching what they're doing, and they have to take a cue like that and be able to follow someone in the blink of an eye. And that takes a lot of rehearsal. That takes certain skill, and these jazz bands are real. They're units, right? They're locked in, and you could get away in a rock band or a metal band. You can get away with the bass player maybe, or the keyboard player being not as good as everybody else, as long as you got a great rhythm guitar player and the singer's good, and you got a great lead guitar player. You can probably get by. The drummer's probably got to be really good, but you really can't do that in jazz. It's like every one of them has to be at the top of their game at all time. And you're right. It's probably like the scariest thing to be in some of these top-notch jazz bands, that if you are not 100% confident of your abilities, that's got to be nerve-wracking to know that you've got to perform like this night after night after night.
Yeah. And then just finally, I think the last thing I'd add on jazz is the way that it's not perfect is the melody is like black metal pushing metal over the cliff. That they push melody over the cliff, that it's so complex that it's only for the hallowed few. Like you have to be really sophisticated to like that melody. So what I'm saying is like a sensible, objective, childlike, definition and like, predilection towards liking certain melodies. They ain't gonna like it because it's too far over the cliff, and there's a lot of soloing and stuff going on, and people would
It's
say
noodling, it's chaos, right?
yeah, it's chaos. And if you're a non-sophisticated music fan, you don't want you want patterns. You don't want soloing. So let's go in a complete other direction here.
There you go.
Let's go to all the polar opposite of jazz is punk, right? And I would offer that there's almost nothing perfect about punk. Although, again, millions of people love it, and why? Same kind of reasons they like death metal and black metal. So we've got the Dead Boys, the mean median average of a punk situation. So they're young, so they're inexperienced, so they can't be good musicians. They're loud, so they have no dynamics, and it's just annoying because who wants loud? And they're snotty, so who wants snotty, right? And they're standing in an alley, so it's like this is the opposite of a perfect photo shoot. It's dark. It's they haven't dressed up plainly for the occasion, so it's not perfect clothes. It's the opposite of a wedding dress.
They might not have washed their hair or taken a shower in like a week.
Exactly. Yeah. They don't look happy to be there. They don't look happy to serve you music. And the logo is just scrawled on like it's painted on a wall. So they haven't made the perfect logo. It ain't the angel upside down logo that they're giving us. It's green and black and neon. And then on the back, same kind of thing. And we're now in a shower. It's not a great photo shoot. There's shadow. So the whole idea of that, so I again, it's probably the least perfect music we're going to talk about in this genre. Nothing is perfect about the playing isn't perfect. The production, the albums are made quickly. The singing ain't perfect. What they're singing about, you may go down the road that there's some lyrics here that are kind of like important and interesting, but it's the whole package and the aesthetic that people like. And again, it's like adult taste versus kids taste. You're not supposed to like anything about this, but then ironically on the other end is if some good simple, let's say polished pop punk, maybe a Green Day or a Rancid or something like that. It's funny if you give that to a toddler, they might love that compared to a bunch of other things because it's not scary, right? And maybe it's got melody and stuff like that, and maybe something in the rebelliousness of it, the speed and the distorted guitars and the screaming and the hollering and the energy is going to appeal to a kid. So yeah, it's there may be some kid tastes in punk, probably no kid tastes in jazz. So I would think if just like black metal, you could tick off every single box with punk and say there's nothing perfect in it at all. So I'll stop there on punk.
But you could also say, look at how many like offshoots from punk we've seen over the years. I mean, and we've even seen like a renaissance, like in the 90s, with like alternative music, which had a lot of punk influence, right, for a new generation. So I think there's a reason why it remains popular and why people are gravitated towards it. And I think to some of it, especially the more modern stuff, there's a tunefulness there. There's an energy that they really like. Yeah. Whereas I think the punk bands that first started, like you said, they're grungy, they're dirty, it's raw, there's nothing perfect about it. But obviously something is appealing to a lot of people, right?
Yeah. I had two more things to show here and just make a quick point. So Sex Pistols, this is considered the greatest punk album of all time, but why? So one of the reasons is the production's really good. It sounds kind of really powerful production wise. So all of a sudden you're adding a little bit of perfection in there, and it's enough to sweeten things for everybody. And it's very tuneful. The songs are well put together. And possibly even lyrically, Johnny's saying some extra interesting things, and that's going to come in one of mine later. And then the last point I wanted to make is you go back to kind of an original punk classic, the Stooges, right? So I've often talked about how, okay, so these guys get back together in the 2000s or whatever and put out 2 albums. It's like, how or why do you recreate something that was just like lightning in a bottle, a mess, heavy and raw and all that stuff. And now you're forced to do that in the 2000s. It's like, okay, you look at each other in a room and go, so do we take a bunch of drugs and drink a bunch to do this? Or do we play badly on purpose? Or do we record badly on purpose? Like Steve Albini. And you think of the third Nirvana album. It's like, let's dirty this up. Right. So they dirty it up, and obviously, so this episode's about perfection. So they're making the third Nirvana album less perfect than the second Nirvana album, but it's again saying, we're adults, we have sophisticated, non-obvious tastes. It's going to be a subjective thing now. It's objectively less perfect, but there's just something on a more sophisticated level that's making what we're doing. We're striving for a different kind of perfection.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right. Let's move on to blues, shall we?
Okay.
Blues has been around a long time, right? Been around, kind of the origins, so they say, so the history books say, came from like kind of like the Civil War time, the late 1800s here in the US. African Americans liberated from slavery. They took some of the traditional music from their homeland in Africa and kind of made it their own thing, as people started moving up from the South up north, brought the music with them. All of a sudden you have this thing called blues, rhythm and blues, that sort of thing. And over the years you've got Muddy Waters and Robert Johnson, right? John Lee Hooker, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, Albert Collins, right? A lot of traditional blues legends that are looked at quite fondly over the years. In most cases, blues music, very, especially early on, very stripped down arrangements, pentatonic scales, polyrhythms, bare bones production, usually the naked voice, all right, and a guitar. Look at Robert Johnson, voice, an acoustic guitar, and a bottleneck slide. That's it, right? Basic. Again, music at its purest form. I think, a lot of some of these things that, especially that I'm talking about early on, is all these grandiose production values and auto-tune and all this bullshit that's, we've seen so much in recent years. None of that here. This is just, it's very emotional music, comes from the heart. Lyrics are always centered on human emotions and stories. You got, again, the whole naked voice thing, call and response vocals, right? But more importantly, I think blues music, most people, when they talk about blues, they say it's music that makes me feel good. Because you can tell that the people who created it from the heart. The lyrics are all about stuff that's personal to them, right? And a lot of it's guitar and vocal oriented, right? So you've got all these legendary guitar players. I just mentioned a whole bunch of them, right? There's so many more. Then you got some of the vocalists too. Etta James and Billie Holiday. You got Willie Dixon. Just creating this very personal music that just feels heavy because you could tell it's heavy coming from the heart type of thing.
Yeah.
Right. And another thing too, it's like if blues wasn't one of those perfect musical art forms, why would so many artists copy the music over the years, right? So you've got like all those British players, like in the 60s and the 70s, were basically taking licks and songs from the traditional US blues people and making it their own, right? And you look back on rock and roll history, especially the 70s and the 80s, and so many musicians talk about how their influences were, B.B. King and Muddy Waters and whatnot. And still to this day, people are covering these classic blues songs. So it's like, if it wasn't a perfect and beloved art form, after all these years, why would people still give a shit, right? And again, I think it's perfect because it's uncluttered. I think music is raw. Blues music is raw. It's primal. But on the same token, I know people who find blues not perfect because it is so raw, because it is so harsh. Maybe you don't have perfect vocals, right? It's, again, some of the early bluesmen and women, not considered, the greatest singers on the planet, but it was all feel, right? Production values of a lot of the original blues records, very, very, just harsh and, raw and bare bones, right? And, for people who are not into guitar oriented music, maybe there's too much soloing, right? Maybe the reliance on pentatonic scales and things like that is a little bit too predictable, and, you get too much repetition there. I don't know, but I think it's a style of perfect music because it is so raw and it is so primal and it is so bare bones, because that's what music is all about. It should be someone singing, someone playing an instrument. Here it is, and that's all you got. And there's something to be said about that. And I think that's the reason why blues has persevered for so many decades and has been so important to so many, not only listeners, but other musicians of many different genres as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. That was great. I mean, and I think what I would pick out of that to say what is perfect about the blues is like I love that treatise about the lyrics and being about the human condition and being so from the heart and so simple and stripped down and unpretentious, which makes, it brings it towards that definition of perfect that includes as universal as possible, right? As understandable as possible. And then also, I think also related to that is the idea that there are a lot of rules, so there's a lot of patterns, so it can imprint on the brain, and even a musical novice knows where the song is going next, sort of thing. So again, it's
That
being
structure is
super
always there.
universal again, right?
Yeah.
And then finally, I think the other thing that makes it perfect is this weird thing that I've never completely understood, but the fact that even a lot of our favorite bands where we don't hear any blues at all. I mean, Black Sabbath is a perfect example. Where Tony will say, "Oh, we're just a blues band" or whatever, right? That kind of thing, right? Lemmy, we play rock and roll, right? The idea that there's this mystique of perfection about it, about being like the actual DNA of music, right? Not all music, but the DNA of rock and roll, right? This vast form of music that we all blab about all the time, right? So there's something magical about the perfection of it's literally the building blocks of everything, right? So
Well, it goes back to the simplicity of it, right? Sometimes simple is good. I mean, you have, I think to me, sometimes blues is the total antithesis of jazz, right? I think they have similar roots, but they go in different directions where, blues is very predictable, very emotional driven. A great blues song will either make you feel happy or it'll make you feel sad. And that's probably the intent of the creator. Whereas a jazz is meant to take you in all sorts of different places, right?
Yeah. Okay, so great. So blues is the antithesis of jazz. Punk is the antithesis of jazz. And I think my last category is the antithesis of jazz too. So I've got a bunch of CDs here, but let's just go with some hip hop to start with. D12, that Eminem sort of side projecty thing. There's another D12. Wildly entertaining albums. We've got some pop here with some Madonna. Hang on, I better watch where my lighting is here so we can at least show these things, right? There's an unopened Madonna, tells you how much I like. Hey, it's called Hard Candy. I mean, what could be more universally perfect than hard candy? It's like, okay, give a hard candy, although you don't want your toddler to choke on it, but basically hard candy is the idea of objective food that everybody's supposed to like because it's just pure sugar, right?
Yeah.
And we got Pink there, and everything. So we've got some more, and then we get some more, a little more sophisticated hip hop with ASAP Ferg, and we've got some here's some pop. My category, if you haven't noticed, is pop and hip hop together. So we've got some pop country here, the mega selling Garth Brooks.
There you go.
And we've got some more some later hip hop, later Run DMC. And then I love this album to death. I played this hundreds of times. Rehab, Southern Discomfort, I think it's called. Yeah, this wildly entertaining hip hop, right? A lot of stuff about drugs. So why am I saying that this there's certain things about this that is perfect and certain things that aren't? So let's hip hop to begin with. Basically, the idea is there's not much music to it at all. And it's all about really getting the most value you can possibly get out of a vocalist. Just wildly entertaining, flashy, hilarious words and stories, profanity, drugs, girls, shooting up the place, whatever, right? Poetry, right? And it's funny. You listen to a certain my relationship with hip hop is really weird. Like I like only like 5% of anything I hear, but then that 5%, I'm just like laughing the whole time and loving it and playing it over and over and over again. Right. So I was like, I have a handful of hip hop albums I play all the time, and then almost everything else I don't like. Right. So, pop is another thing. I don't like any pop whatsoever. But so the idea here is that, so the funny thing is, is if you listen to a bunch of hip hop, it's really hard going back to Robert Plant lyrics, right? You go back and you play some stupid, bluesy Led Zeppelin lyric, and you go, this is like positively like illiterate compared to this, right? So it's almost like, so it's the opposite of jazz in that jazz has no singing, and this is almost all about the singing. So hip hop in its most rudimentary form doesn't have a lot of melody. It's got a lot of rhythm and percussion. And so here's the other thing. So in terms of a rhythm section, it's wildly entertaining because there's like scratch sounds and samples and weird mixes of acoustic and electric, and you grab some drum sample from 1972 and it's in there, with like the distortion sounds from the needle because it's a bad record. And so the funny thing is they're really trying to entertain you with the rhythm, and they're really trying to entertain you with the vocals. And as we've talked about with a lot of this music, perfect music maybe isn't supposed to have any vocals, right? So in a sense, what it is, to me, hip hop's almost like picking up a poetry book and reading poetry, right? Poetry versus prose, because poetry is super condensed. You have to slow down. It's really deep. No words are wasted. Yet paragraphy books, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, whatever, there's a bunch of ands and thes in between, and it's made easier to read, right? So it's super, super dense lyrics. And so I would argue there's a weird perfection to hip hop, because they are really giving you a lot of value in those two departments, but there ain't a lot of melody, and there ain't a lot of instruments, guitars usually. So moving on to pop a little bit. So I wanted to end with this because I don't think hip hop's the perfect music. And it has a lot of things about it that aren't perfect. And let's be honest, I mean, a lot of people say it's not music at all, right? They literally will disqualify hip hop from even being in the musical category, right? But when it comes to pop, the funny thing about pop is that I think it's the closest thing to perfect music in terms of those childish tastes, because everything's written by a committee. It's 2 or 3 producers per song, or 10 per album. Perfect singing voices. It's literally what an objective person would call singing. Whereas half this stuff we've talked about ain't that, right? The lyrics are really straightforward. They try to entertain you with rhythm as well, with those stupid breakdowns and the speeding up and the do, things that literally like shiny baubles that will excite a toddler, right? That's what pop essentially is. It's basically just made not to, you're not supposed to think too much. So it's very universal. It's about dancing. Quite often it's about materialism, just everything shiny and perfect and bubblegummy, right? That's why it had bubbles. So it's pop throughout all the ages. There's poppy country, there's the Carpenters, there's Tony Orlando and Dawn, there's Elton John. So nothing about it, nothing about pop is designed to make you to force you to debate yourself about adult taste versus children's taste. It's all children's tastes. There's nothing in it that's really like
and you either like it or you don't like it, right?
Yeah, there's no beer in it, there's no coffee, there's no oysters, there's no steak. It's literally like chocolate bars, cotton candy, goldfish, whatever, chips, it's literally just junk food, right?
Yeah.
But hip hop's a funny one. Hip hop, like I say, it's like it really is pretty wildly entertaining when it comes to the words. But is words something that you could just read in a book? Because the jazz people will tell you it's not even music if you add words to it, right? It's less pure, it's less perfect. So
yeah,
there's my pop rant.
Yeah, most people that I talk to that like hip hop, I'm not one of them, by the way, but most people who I talk to, they say, "Oh, I really like hip hop and even some rap because I love the beat and I love what they're talking about." Right? Not even what they're singing about, like what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So there's a message there, right? So whatever it is that they're spewing, and that beat is irresistible to some people. And as far as like pop goes, I think pop will forever be that musical form that is I think that the driving factor is always the record labels are always like searching for the next big thing. How can we create that next big candy bar that the masses are going to love? And it's going to be so delicious and have the great combination of chocolate and nougat and peanut butter and all that sort of thing. And they'll keep spewing them out till they kind of catch on. You're not really listening to pop music to hear that great guitar solo or that wonderful little passage there. It's just all about ear candy, created, mass produced for the masses, right? So of course they're going to continue to try and crank out the most perfect little piece of candy that everybody will want to eat, in this case listen to.
But there is something admirable about ear candy. Not well, so we didn't even talk about hooks and catchiness, but pop and hip hop even more, gives like a sophisticated audiophile an experience, right? You know, there are fun doodads, there's bells and whistles to listen to, and in most of what we talked about so far, they ain't about any of that, right? So there's a little bit of a perfect thing too. Like they're giving you more perfect sound because they're giving you a bunch of fun sounds that kids could like and adults can like, and you know, and this brings up the point that that maybe music is more perfect. Maybe one measure of it is how much it sells, right?
Yeah.
So you know, you could say perfection is something that touches many more hearts, even if they're not sophisticated music fans or whatever. You know, in the pop thing, I can go down that whole road about your singer songwriters and your Fleetwood Macs and Billy Joels and Tom Petty's, who are just trying to write the perfect simple song. It goes from A to B. Not much happens. There's no musical heroes in any of these bands, right? But if there are, you have to speak really abstractly about why they're so great. You know, Lindsey Buckingham, right? You know, this is what's great about him, but it's not obvious. It's not Yngwie Malmsteen. You know, it's not objectively. You have to go subjective on it, right? So,
well, that's a good point, and that goes back to the argument. Do you feel that maybe back in the 70s or the 80s that the artists themselves were more trying to come up with those perfect little simple stories that would convey themselves in a positive light to listeners, as opposed to today where, you know, labels and producers are just cranking out stuff left and right using whatever kind of technology they can to put stuff together, and maybe the artists themselves don't have as much input into the final product as they did back in the day with a lot of those artists you mentioned.
Yeah. Wow, we've gone this whole hour without mentioning the Beatles even once, right?
Right.
And so that's your gold standard of writing the perfect song, right? But this episode's about perfect music, not perfect song. So
right, correct
too,
yeah.
Right?
Correct. All right, so we'll finish this episode off on arguably a controversial pick for perfection. That is progressive rock. Why not save the best for last, right? So to prog rock fans, right? Prog rock is absolutely perfect, right? Let's fuse psychedelia, early rock and roll with classical, jazz, and folk elements, right? Why not, right? Oftentimes, perfectly placed notes, and a lot of them. Virtuoso solos, generally from guitars and any kind of keyboard you can possibly imagine. Intricate rhythms and polyrhythms. Symphonic elements meant to mimic an actual classical orchestra, usually performed on various electronic keyboards like synthesizers, electric piano, Hammond organ, and the mellotron, right? Long songs, multi-part suites, all right? Prog rock just countered traditional rock and pop song structures and time lengths, right? We're not going to do 2 to 3 minute long songs. We're going to go 6, 7, 8, 25 minutes long, right? We're going to press the boundaries of and progress and push the boundaries and progress into new and unknown territories. You know, where pop and psych at the time and rock might have been somewhat predictable. You know, prog taught us that anything is possible. The music can go in any direction, which is also what many people find appealing about jazz. You know, many of the great guitar and keyboard solos and soloists of the kind of the classic days of the 60s and 70s, oftentimes you can link back to certain songs and albums that were progressive rock albums. You know, things like you know, Close to the Edge by Yes, and you know, Genesis, selling them by the pound. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, brain salad surgery. Also there is this kind of stigma that some of the most perfect sounding albums of all time were prog rock albums, right? Dark Side of the Moon, cited as one of the greatest produced albums of all time. Every note is absolutely perfect. Supertramp, Crime of the Century, also heralded for its just absolute perfection. Perfect songs, perfect production. Everything just sounds amazing with it. The studio recordings, glossy, right? Great ear candy, lots going on, right? Using every known technology that they possibly could at their disposal. At the time in the 70s, that was something to do, right? But on the flip side, right? Prog is too abstract. Lyrics are confusing, kind of vague. Songs are way too long. They meander too much. Too many solos. Maybe the vocals aren't quite melodic enough, right? Whereas to a lot of prog rock fans, it's like, who cares what the vocals are? Listen to that. Listen to that Hammond organ. Listen to that guitar solo from Steve Howe. Holy cow, did you hear that mellotron? Right? Who cares what the lyrics are about? Who cares that John Anderson's writing about topographic oceans and all this kind of stuff? Who cares? It's absolute perfection, right? So, some of these bands that I mentioned were obviously lots of other ones, Jethro Tull and Rush and Camel and Vandergraaf Generator and a lot of bands that are still playing today. But to prog rock fans, it's absolutely perfect. And there's a whole snobbiness thing too, kind of like the jazz snobs. A lot of prog rock fans will sniff their nose at other genres that we've talked about today, and only prog is the perfect style of music. But to many people, prog is kind of unlistenable, right? And it doesn't hold their attention. There's not enough tuneful melodies. Where's the hooks? Where's all that kind of stuff? So it's all on the listener, right?
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is like, so what do you mean you don't like us? We're trying harder than every other musician
Right.
in every other genre. Look how much work we put into this, right?
Yeah.
So on a really sensible, childlike, objective level, they're essentially saying we're trying to make the most perfect music possible. And perfection, and we're back to the cars again, right? I mean, a Rolls Royce or an Aston Martin. I mean, prog is that versus a an assembly line Honda Civic, right?
Yeah.
So they're saying we're lit, and that's closer to a perfect car, right? But then again, perfect cars like that. And I worked in a lot of stereo stores as a kid. The super high-end stereo equipment was the stuff that broke down all the time, right? The Carvers and the Macintoshes and everything, right? All the high-end stuff was the stuff that was being hauled down the steps to our service guy all the time, right? So that it's funny. So it's like there are these pitfalls and flaws in this music, but
right.
But
if it was so perfect, it would have lasted a long time. But really, the heyday of prog was what, 4 or 5 years? That's it. So they said all they could say in those couple of years, and then what did they do? They all started playing pop music right afterwards because they didn't know what else to do. So yeah.
And like when we were doing Metal Evolution, that quote Sam got out of Yngwie Malmsteen that is now immortal, right? It's like, what do you mean less is more? Only more is more, right? so it's like it's so funny, and we just all cracked up laughing when we heard that. But the point is, these prog guys are like, of course it is, perfect. To make music more perfect, the song's got to be long. We got to get a lot of stuff in here to get closer to perfection, right?
Yeah.
So that's the funny thing. And so, yeah, like you say, just like jazz, they're essentially, their mindset is, well, to make perfect music, we literally have to be the very best at basketball and the 100-yard dash. And we literally have to be out there breaking the records to be perfect. Right. And I've often said this about Rush. It's kind of a weird take on Rush, but, they got all that abuse back in the 70s from the rock snobbery rock press, for being tasteless in making the fills too complicated and syncing up the the toms with the bass and all that. And it's like, oh, how silly is that? And how
it's excessive, right? Yeah.
But then Rush became famous because, I often say that Rush became famous and infamous and big and sold a lot of records and became a huge successful band because nobody else had the bad taste to do that. Right. So everybody else said, oh, no, that's that's gratuitous. This is how you write a perfect song. You're the Eagles, right? The worst drummer in the world, Don Henley, the worst productions in the world. Eagles productions are terrible, right? When it comes to like the drum sound and the rhythms or whatever. But whatever. So the point is, it's like Eagles are just trying to bore you to death, but bring everybody in. And Rush is like saying, we'll do this. And then, but the problem is with Rush is they took a lot of stick for that because nobody else would dare do that. Yeah. So they literally invented progressive metal because nobody else in metal would want to play that much because it's in such bad taste. And yet all of a sudden you emerge at the end of the 70s and you look back and go, oh, wow, well, that's kind of interesting. There's only one band that ever did this. And so they're rewarded for that because they were the one band who dared to be that, in that bad taste, to do that, right?
To do that daring, right? Yep.
Yeah, and Prague basically gets that abuse, and yet they think they're trying to be perfect, right. and yet, it's very limited because there are so many things about it that the masses won't like. So,
yeah. So there you have it, everybody. A discussion of perfect musical genres. Let us know if you agree or disagree. It's all in fun, right? So this was a fun exercise, I think. And that there's perfectness. I think the ear of the beholder, right? The eyes and the ear of the beholder. You may have musical art forms that you find perfect for various reasons, and that's the way it should be. If we all like the same thing, it'd be a pretty boring world. So,
but I think the most important thing is that to be able to look at the music you like, and it's kind of an interesting exercise like we just did. Look at the music you like and think about what's perfect in it and what's not perfect.
What's not. Well, it's the whole point counterpoint thing. It's like, I think everybody needs to understand that what you find pleasing to the ears is cacophony to someone else, and what are the reasons for and against and why not type of thing. Yeah, that's just the way music is, right? Classical music to some might be the most gorgeous music ever created, and to other people it's just like, I don't see the appeal, right?
I guess that's the big one we left out, right? But I think the classical discussion would be just kind of down the jazz.
It's very similar, right? Yeah,
except for the improv part, right?
Right. Yeah, very classical is very composed. But I think there's a musicality to it. There's certain similarities to jazz, but yeah, the improv nature is with jazz is very, very different from pretty much everything else we talked about.
Mm-hmm. And classical is also perfect in that it can be really loud with no electronic interference.
Right? Exactly. Yep, for sure. All right, Martin, what's new on your end? Got any new books in stock ready to ship? Or
the latest thing that just came in was the Cure panel book, where we used a lot of the Contrarians people. So it's basically a trawl through the Cure studio album catalog in a Q&A thing, and I'm the the master of ceremonies, as it were, and then I did a detailed timeline. So that thing just came out, and that's now at my site, martinpopoff.com. We've got a Bluish Occult one coming down the pikes of that as well. But yeah, martinpopoff.com for that. Of course, I got the audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, and we got the video channel with Contrarians.
There you go. Cool. Let's see what do we got coming up here on the channel. We are talking to today, and probably be posting this on the channel later today, talking to Derek Sherinian and Virgil Donati, of course, keyboard player extraordinaire and drummer virtuoso, both from the band Planet X. Planet X is going to be releasing in July their anthology box set, which is going to contain all 4 of their albums that are right now, I believe, out of print, in a nice little box set with a cool 20-page booklet and all sorts of other information in there. So they're going to be coming onto the channel to talk to me about all that. So that's coming up later today. We've got also Curse of the Collectors happening this weekend, as well as ranking the albums. I'll be ranking the catalog of Blondie coming up on Sunday. So there's that. And I'm sure a few other things happening, so stay tuned for all that and more. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together, all the damn time. Please also go over to martinpopoff.com. Check out all the great books he's got for sale there, and please hit the like button before you leave. So, and also, if you're interested in going over to the Sea of Tranquility merch page, and you get this cool octopus, or like I call it, the Release the Kraken shirt, that's available, and the link below to our merch page. And yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. Tune in next Friday for another episode episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse. Have a great weekend. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.